Hello, and welcome to Chapter 3, Organizing and Drafting Business Messages, Sections 3 through 5. Section 3 deals with composing the first draft with effective sentences. Once you've researched your topic, organized the data, and selected a strategy, you're ready to begin drafting. As you begin writing, think about what style fits you best. Some experts suggest that you write quickly. This is called free writing. You want to get your ideas down and refine them in later versions. But first, we're going to talk about some grammar. The 4 sentence types are simple sentences, compound sentences, complex sentences, and compound complex sentences. And the reason that we vary these types of sentences is so that we don't have our writing become boring with the same sentence type. It avoids monotony, it adds spark to your writing. And so we're going to focus in on exactly what makes up each of these 4 sentence types. Simple sentences contain one complete thought, an independent clause, with a subject and a predicate verb. Let's look at the example on the board. The entrepreneur saw an opportunity. Entrepreneur is the subject, saw is the verb. Compound sentences contain 2 complete but related thoughts. In other words, 2 independent clauses. They can be joined in one of 3 ways. A conjunction such as and, but, or, with a comma, a semicolon, or a conjunctive adverb such as however, consequently, and therefore. So let's look at our examples. The entrepreneur saw an opportunity and she responded quickly, or immediately. So entrepreneur is our subject in our first independent clause. Saw is the verb. She is the subject in the second independent clause. Responded is the verb. But look at how each of the sentences are punctuated differently. Complex sentences contain an independent clause, in other words, a complete thought, and a dependent clause, a thought that can't stand by itself. Dependent clauses are often introduced by words such as although, since, because, when, and if. Now, if the dependent clauses are at the beginning of the sentence, they're always followed by a comma, because you don't have a word at the start of an independent clause to let you know that the independent clause is beginning. But if the independent clause comes first, the words that lead off the dependent clauses tend to let us know, so we don't need a comma. So let's look at this example. When the entrepreneur saw the opportunity, she responded immediately. Entrepreneur is the subject and saw is the verb of our dependent clause. Note that comma. And then she is the subject and responded is the verb in the independent clause. The final type of sentence is the compound complex sentence. This contains at least 2 independent clauses, therefore making it compound, and 1 dependent clause, making it complex. When the entrepreneur saw the opportunity, she responded immediately. However, she needed capital. When the entrepreneur saw the opportunity is the dependent clause. She responded immediately is one of the independent clauses. However, she needed capital is another independent clause. Now, there are basically 3 types of traps as you start to form your sentences that you need to avoid. Those are fragments, run-ons or fused sentences, and comma splices. If you have any of these faults appearing in your business message, you will immediately lose credibility with your audience. Let's look at fragments first. Fragments are, as I put it, a little broken off piece of a sentence. They can't stand on their own. Sometimes it's a dependent clause that's introduced with although, as, because, even, except. For example, if instead of, since, such as, that, which, and when. Sometimes it's merely a phrase. It doesn't even have to be a dependent clause. Let's look at the example. Because most transactions require a permanent record, period, good writing skills are critical, period. In this case, we have a dependent clause that's acting as a fragment, so we're going to combine it with the following independent clause to make it a complex sentence, as you notice in the revision. Run-ons are sentences that contain two independent clauses, but don't have a conjunction and a comma, or they don't have a semicolon. Let's look at the example. Many job seekers prepare traditional resumes. Some also use websites as electronic portfolios. Notice in the revision that they simply divide it into two sentences. At that point, you could have also included a semicolon in the period's place or done a comma and. A comma splice is where you have two independent clauses and they basically leave off the conjunction. They join them with a comma. Let's look at our example. Some employees prefer desktop computers, others prefer their tablets. Now, if they'd put a semicolon in there, it would be fine. If they'd put a comma but, as the revision does, that would be fine as well. Comma splices are a type of run-on, and they are, to some teachers and some professors in college, unforgivable. So as you look over your writing, you need to make sure that you do not commit one of these three common sentence faults. As a business writer, you also want to make sure that you favor short sentences. Your sentences should average 20 words or less. Basically, at 19 words, the comprehension rate is 80%. At 25 words, it drops off to 50%. So that's something to keep in mind as you write your sentences. Longer sentences aren't always better. Now we're going to move into section 4, which is where we are going to develop business writing techniques. Our first one is kind of fun. It talks about emphasis. And we're going to explore creating emphasis through mechanics and style. And then we're going to look at when it is necessary to de-emphasize, how to best go about doing so. There are several ways you can achieve emphasis through mechanics. The first is underlining. It draws attention to the word. Using italics or boldface will convey special meaning. Font changes, you can select a large or a small font or even a different font to draw interest. So if you have like a flyer or a passage where you have it in one font and you suddenly change it to a complementary font, it can really draw the reader's eye, your audience's eye. If you put it in all caps, it's kind of like shouting at a person. Dashes, if you use them sparingly, can be effective. And also, if you want to tabulate, either use bullets or numbered lists. If you stack something vertically, it allows the items to stand out even better. Because remember, when you're writing, you don't have that same richness of channel as we saw in the previous chapter as you do when you're talking face-to-face. If I'm talking face-to-face and I am excited and I'm banging on tables, you get the idea that I'm excited. You get the idea from my voice as well. But if it's in my writing, I have to take different approaches so that you can see that emphasis. So let's move on to emphasis through style. We want to try to use vivid words. We want to make sure we label the main idea so our audience knows, hey, this is what's important. We also want to make sure we place our important ideas either first for the primacy effect or last for the latency effect. People tend to remember what they're told first and last in a long presentation, as well as important ideas need to be spotlighted. So I'm just going to leave this up so you can kind of gaze at it for a few seconds before we move on. If you want to make sure, this is again in section 3, 4, A. All very good examples and non-examples of the components of adding emphasis through style. Moving on, we're going to talk about we're going to talk about de-emphasis first. And there are times when you do need to de-emphasize. You want to make sure you use general words when your audience, again, could get offended. In cases of bad news, you want to make sure you use de-emphasis rather than emphasis. Instead of saying, our records indicate that you were recently fired, you could instead say, our records indicate that your employment status has recently changed. And another way to handle this is to place the bad news in a dependent clause connected to an independent clause that contains something positive, using that honey to trap more flies than vinegar. Instead of saying, we cannot issue you credit at this time, but we have a special plan that will allow you to fill your immediate needs on a cash basis, you can say that although credit cannot be issued at this time, you can fill your immediate needs on a cash basis with our special plan. Again, the reader wants to see what's in it for them, that WIIFM that we saw in the last chapter. Moving on to active and passive voice. In the case of active voice, the doer is who is performing the action. This allows for more direct, easier to understand sentences that are often shorter sentences, and it's what's used in most business writing. The example on the board says, Justin must submit a tax return. The doer is followed by the action, which is followed by the receiver. But in the case of passive voice sentences, the doer receives the action. It's used to emphasize the action instead of a person. It's also used in business writing to de-emphasize negative news and conceal the doer. And in some cases, the doer will be left out entirely. Let's look at our example sentence. The tax return was submitted. Now, we know from the previous sentence that Justin's the one who submitted it. So we can put by Justin at the end, but we don't have to. If someone is trying to shift the blame or cover up the blame in something that involves bad news, they'll sometimes put it in passive voice and leave off that doer. Maybe that tax return wasn't supposed to be submitted quite yet. So they don't want to get Justin in trouble, so they'll just simply say the tax return was submitted. However, if you do include the doer, the format is receiver followed by action followed by doer. Moving on, another thing to look at in terms of writing efficiently is parallelism. Parallelism is a skillful writing technique that creates balanced writing. Let's look at our example of what is not parallel. The policy affected all vendors, suppliers, and those involved with consulting. Okay, so we have vendors, we have items in a series, we have noun items in the series. At least it starts out being that way. Vendors, suppliers, and We got a whole bunch of gobbledygook that doesn't match the rest of the sentence. Instead, to make it parallel, it should read, the policy affected all vendors, suppliers, and consultants, instead of putting a clause in place. So, in that case, the nouns match up. And if you look at section 3.4c, there are even more examples of making sentences parallel. Another common trap that we run into when writing and speaking, where if we think about it, it actually ends up causing some fairly silly results, are dangling and misplaced modifiers. Because here's the issue. Modifiers must be placed close to the words they describe or limit. If not, you have one of two things happen. You have a dangling modifier, which is where the word that the modifier modifies or describes is missing. Let's look at the example. After working overtime, the report was finally finished. Okay, so we have the modifier after working overtime. And in the case of after working overtime, the report isn't what was working overtime. And we don't really know, based on the rest of the sentence, who it was that was working overtime to finish the report. So when we rewrite the sentence, we have to put that information in. After working overtime, we finally finished the report. And that's a major issue with modifiers. If you have long introductory verbal phrases, you need to make sure you follow them immediately with the words they logically describe or modify. Sometimes, though, you'll have a misplaced modifier, where the word or phrase the modifier describes is simply not close enough to be clear. Let's look at this sentence. Firefighters rescued a dog from a burning car that had a broken leg. Well, the way this sentence is written, the burning car has the broken leg. I'm fairly certain the burning car is not who has the broken leg. It could be the firefighters, possibly, although they'd have a lot of difficulty rescuing a dog from a burning car if they had a broken leg. So it's more likely that if you look at the fixed sentence, that firefighters rescued a dog with the broken leg from a burning car. Again, the way you place these sentences determines whether your reader, your audience, will be successful in understanding your message. Which leads us to section 5, where we're going to talk about drafting well-organized, effective paragraphs. And we're going to go ahead and dive in with the components of a paragraph. Remember that good business writers develop well-organized paragraphs by focusing on a single main idea. The sentences in the paragraphs cohere or stick together by using transitional expressions. Paragraphs contain topic as well as support sentences. A paragraph is unified when it develops a single main idea in the form of a topic sentence. Now, in most cases in writing, the topic sentence could appear at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end of a paragraph. However, business writers who want to make their main idea clear tend to put their topic sentences as the first sentence of the paragraph. This lets the reader know what to expect and helps them understand the paragraph's central thought immediately. Now, every sentence in the paragraph, with the exception of the topic sentence, has to support the topic sentence. That's why the other sentences are called support sentences. They illustrate, they explain, or they strengthen the topic sentences. If you have any other topics brought up in the support sentences, they really need to be moved to another paragraph. They provide specific details, explanations, and evidence. Now, at the beginning of this section, I talked a little bit about coherence, where the idea of the word cohere means to stick together. So paragraphs stick together or are coherent when ideas are linked. In other words, when one idea logically leads to another. The idea you want to try to shoot for in business writing, because you have typed blocks of text usually, is a paragraph should be 8 or fewer typed lines. The eye kind of gets eye blind after that point. So you really, to be able to keep your audience focused on what you're saying, on the message you're trying to deliver, you really want to make sure your paragraphs are fewer than 8 lines long. But to aid in coherence, there are a few steps you can follow. Number 1, you can repeat a key idea using the same expression or a similar one. You can use pronouns to refer to previous nouns in previous sentences. It kind of links it together without having to use a transition. And you can also show connections with those transitional expressions. Now what I want you to work on is the Google Doc found in Google Classroom for 3.3 through 3.5. If any time remains, you can work on your research project. If time is called before you finish, this assignment is for homework.